My father, Joseph Freiler, was an immigrant from Austria. He came here before I was born in 1860, and he settled in the New York area. I was actually born in Hartford, Connecticut, but Father ran a hotel in New York City for a while, and then he came to the city of Chicago and he ran a wholesale liquor business. And then after a few years of doing that, he moved to the city of Elgin. Well, along with my father and the business came my mother Mary, my two brothers, my four sisters, and myself, Philip Freiler. Elgin was a good town. It has been a wonderful town. And we had a bit with my father had the liquor business here, but in 1883, that year became a year of beginnings for me, personally. Because in 1883, due to my father's poor health, he sold the liquor business to me. And we restarted it as Philip Freiler Liquors here in Elgin. Also in 1883, I had the wonderful beginning of my life with my beloved wife, Lizzie. And we had 4 beautiful daughters. We lost a baby Helen before she was 2 years old to the diphtheria. But life goes on, and our daughter Florence brought us great pleasure. Our daughter Florence made all the social pages of all the newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, and all the Elgin newspapers when she was engaged to be married to Charles Lederer, a leading and prominent Chicago attorney. And 2 months later, when the wedding occurred, the newspapers again put stories in the paper. Charles and Florence Lederer's wedding was brilliant. So it was a wonderful thing for our family, there's one of those mosquitoes, to be mentioned in those social circles. After all, my grandfather came over penniless from Austria. We were very happy about that. Our business was located at 12 River Street, Philip Freiler Liquors, 12 River Street, phone number 202. We had a 24,000 square foot facility, a 2-story building. We had 2 wine cellars, and then on the first floor behind our storefront, we had a counting room and a bottling room. We also had our offices, and then on the second floor, 2 warerooms for the storage of old whiskey. That's, of course, where we aged the whiskey. You see, as a wholesale liquor distributor, we purchased our supplies in barrels, in barrel quantities from distillers and vineyards, wineries. And then we would bottle the liquor and the wines, put them in bottles, attach our labels and our branding. We would also blend the whiskeys to make the kinds of whiskeys that people could expect to have the consistent quality associated with our brand names. And that was the foundation of our business. This is an example of some of the things that we did to make sure that people always remembered our brands. Century Club Whiskey, Philip Freiler, Elgin, Illinois. We decided that a good portion of the time when people were enjoying our beverages, they were playing cards. Well, a great way to make sure that they remember the kind of beverage that they should be drinking. For those people that didn't play cards, craftsmen, mechanics, anybody, a wonderful little booklet with a place to find useful information for contractors, how to prevent fires, a calendar for writing down notes and appointments, a map if you want to know where Cuba is and what it's all about, the memoranda for notes, valuable information, brief business laws. We had hoped that this would be close to the hearts of everybody, and so we gave them away. And of course, when they reached to their heart, they would notice that they were reading about Philip Freiler, Elgin, Illinois, sole proprietor of Father Time Rye, Century Club Bourbon and Rye, Ready Money Rye, a trio hard to beat. A pretty catchy slogan, wouldn't you agree? We gave these away, and they were one of the foundations of our business. This is an example of the packaging that we used for our bottles. You'll notice that we had a respected label, Father Time, Old Elgin Rye Whiskey, none genuine unless label bears my signature. And I signed the labels to verify their authenticity. Now, we had distribution of our beverages in 9 states. We went as far as the Dakotas on the west and through the state of Illinois, or Indiana, to the east. 9 states. We had over 20 brands. I'll pass this around. This is just a little sampling of some of the brands we sold. Little Joe Sour Mash, Congress Club, Century Club, Ready Money, Freiler's Silver Tide, Freiler's Old Little Elgin. Pass that around. Those are some of the things we did. On the personal side, we were able to build a beautiful home up on Douglas Avenue. We had the interior furnished with beautiful hardwoods. We had cherry, we had oak, we had a barn out back, a model barn right behind the house. We had 5 mantles in our home: butternut, maple, cherry, oak, and mahogany. And that house cost us over $12,000. We did well in our business, but I don't want you to think that business was all that Philip Freiler is about. You see, one of my proudest memories, and one of the things that I'm most happy about, is another item, namely the Elgin National Road Races. You see, the Elgin National Road Races was an idea that was brought to the citizens of Elgin, some of the business people like myself, by the Chicago Motor Club. And so, convinced by them that this was a good place to hold such a race, we formed the Elgin Automobile Race Association in the spring of 1910. We raised $20,000 in capital, and the money we used for purchasing frontage rights from farmers whose property laid along the race course. We also had to purchase liability insurance. We had to award prize money. We had to pay the National Guard and the policemen for crowd control. And we had to do extensive advertising. That was what some of the $20,000 was used for. We also sold tickets. We had a very good turnout, but before we got the chance to do that, we had to overcome quite an obstacle. And here's what it was. We now think, because we know how wonderful the road races are for the city of Elgin, that it's a wonderful thing. You don't even have to think about it. Well, there were a number of farmers and other people who thought that the road races would be a negative thing for the city of Elgin. We couldn't understand why they didn't agree, but that was our job, to convince them. So the other board members and I, day by day, for a period of several months, would get in our automobiles, we would drive out to the farms, we'd knock on the doors, we'd talk to the farmers, and we'd explain to them what a good thing this is for the city. Not a negative thing. And the other opponents, we would convince. Finally, we got them all convinced. Everybody signed, and the road races were on. And now, everybody, without question, says the Elgin National Road Races are Elgin's proudest accomplishment. And I'm proud to have been the treasurer of the organization since its inception. And this is where you come in. You're voters in Elgin. Please, when people come to you with petitions to sign, I want you to sign them. And when people want you to tell your friends about what's wrong with this dry thing, tell them what's wrong. Remember what I told you. And whenever you have the chance to vote against the dry, vote. Vote, vote, vote. And that's what you can do to redeem Elgin. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. William G. Todd, although around town I was called Doc Todd. I came west from Vermont in 1837 with my family. That's only 2 years after James T. Gifford founded his little settlement of Elgin. In fact, we came the same year that the Birds came. The Birds are commemorated with that log cabin tombstone down there. And our claim extended westward from the Fox River to almost, at least part of Wing Park, on both sides of Wing Street. And we farmed this in the early years. Then eventually my father established a lumber yard, and I worked as a lumber mill hand. In 1850, my father heard about this big gold rush near Pikes Peak, Colorado. And so off we went, but it had a sad ending. My father was stricken, and I had to bring his body home, and we never did look for any gold. In the 1840s, I decided I wanted to be a doctor, and I read medicine with Dr. Joseph Teft, our first mayor. And then I went down to St. Charles at a medical school conducted by a man by the name of George Richard. He knew a lot about medicine. And in our studies, of course, we had to have cadavers. Now, many people in those days were reluctant to donate their bodies to medical science. So we had to dig them up. And when the people in St. Charles got word of this, then we had to take these cadavers and hide them. I brought one here to Elgin that they didn't find. They found one of our skeletons, but then you can't prove anything with a skeleton. Then I heard about this big medical college opening up in Chicago, Rush Medical College. It is now part of the Rush Presbyterian Medical Center, a famous nationwide for its teaching as a teaching hospital. And I was in its first graduating class. And how long did we study medicine there at Rush? 16 weeks. Then we got our MD degrees, and we became doctors. Now, that's a pretty long time, 16 weeks, because many people call themselves doctors who had no training whatsoever in those days. It wasn't until about 1910 that the states began to regulate medical schools and regulate the certificates given to MDs. And that's probably one of the reasons I decided not to practice medicine. People said that I didn't practice medicine because I didn't like the sight of blood. But it seemed to me we couldn't do much in the middle of the 19th century to help people. We had no antibiotics. We didn't have aspirin. We had no real knowledge of the germ theory of disease. The most we could do was put splints on a broken leg, or some kind of analgesic if they had a pain, or some kind of salve on cuts, and that's about it. And if people were cured after calling a doctor, by and large, they cured themselves over time. In fact, in as late as 1900, the life expectancy of an American was 47 years. 47. I lived to be 92 years. 92 years. I came here when Elgin consisted of a few rough log cabins. And I lived to see racing cars run around the West Side track in the road races, and streetcars, and a hospital for the medical ill, and two general hospitals. Well, I was very interested in science, partly because of my medical training. And in 1876, I read about Alexander Graham Bell's invention of what is called a telephone. I said to my two sons, Frank and Charlie, we could do the same thing here in Elgin. I read how it was done. We wrapped a wire around a magnetic coil and strung a wire from the High Northwestern railroad station where Frank worked as a telegrapher to our house. And we had a box in my house, box in the station, and people would pick up that box at the station and hear a voice, and they'd drop the box. First time they ever had heard of anything like a telephone. In 1885, I was a backer of Mayor Henry Willis, who decided, with the advice of many physicians, including me, that we had to abandon individual privies and wells because of the possible contamination and epidemic. And it was going to be expensive converting to city water with the city water works and laying all that pipe. And so the alderman said, well, let the people decide. That's the good way, you see. That way they didn't have to make a decision. And when the people were asked to vote on whether they wanted city water works or whether they wanted to risk an epidemic, you know how they voted. No city water works. Well, Mayor Willis, one of our great mayors, said, it doesn't make any difference how the people decided. We are going to have a city waterworks. And I am proud to say that Dr. William G. Todd's home was the first one to be piped with city water back in 1888. Now, I really enjoyed working with a microscope and a telescope. I had the first private ownership of those two instruments here in Elgin. And I invite people to come to the house and look through my microscope and see these one-celled diatoms. You couldn't see them with your naked eye, but you look through my microscope and there they were wiggling around. Some people didn't believe me. In 1893, I said, all right, I will try to take a photograph of a diatom through my microscope. And sure enough, I got one. And then people believed. Well, I also experimented with Dan Guptill, although I didn't have much faith in it, when he designed a flying machine in which he was a neighbor on South State Street. And the idea was, it was like a big kite with big wings, and he'd strap them to his son, and he would take off from the roof of a barn and collapsed. Well, I lived to be 92, saw a lot of changes, and now I'll take out my Elgin watch, one of the old kind we had, and it says, it's time to go on to your next tour. Thank you.
Now let me ask you the question that I was originally scheduled to ask you. When I mention aloud the word to you, Boston, what comes to your mind? Massachusetts? Tea Party? Well, in a few minutes, you will learn what the word Boston meant to me during my lifetime. But first, allow me the opportunity to introduce myself to this grand conflagration of humanity that has just showed up here in front of me this fine day. My name is Joseph N. Fordresher, and most of you are probably wondering what my connection to Elgin was all about. Well, I'm here to tell you, my friends, that my connection to Elgin was lifelong. From the very start to the very end, I have been connected to this great city. So allow me to begin, appropriately enough, at the very beginning, as I tell you a little bit about my life and times here in this great city. I was born on the 22nd day of July in the year of 1861 here in Elgin to parents Joseph and Lena, both of German descent. My father and namesake was the saloon keeper and bartender down at Augie Schumann's Saloon on Grove Avenue. I had one brother by the name of Christian, and I had twin sisters by the name of Christine and Emma. Is that your name? Excellent. You're not my sister, are you? Okay. I went to all Elgin schools. In fact, while matriculating grade school, I met my wife, my future wife. While we went together at the same school, it was very interesting. We both traversed the road to formal education together until graduation of high school. I eventually married Kitty, my wife, on the 19th day of April in the year of 1883. Now, some of your forefathers might remember Kitty better as lifelong Elgin resident Catherine Needham, whose parents were some of the founding people here in town. My wife and I were blessed with 2 daughters, Celeste the oldest and Hazel the youngest. And we lived at 810 Prospect Avenue and eventually moved a couple of doors away to 834 Prospect. Now, like many an Elgin area resident, I began my post-high school working career at the Elgin National Watch Factory. I was in the flats department, but unlike most, my time there was very, very short-lived. For you see, in the year of 1882, I sought employment with brothers D.J. and F.H. Chamberlain. The Chamberlains owned and operated a clothing store by the name of Big Boston. Big Boston was located on East Chicago Street, not too far from Douglas Avenue, directly across the street from the post office. Now, the clothing store eventually moved to 51 South Grove, and it was there that I became a financial partner along with the brothers. And in the year of 1917, I purchased the company from the family and owned and operated the store, now under my own name of Joseph Fordreshers, for approximately 15 years, during which time the company grew appreciably and became known in Elgin as one of the oldest yet most modern clothing stores we had. I believe that everything in our store should be first class and that it should be up to the standard of our times. This was also true with the advertising that we did in local newspapers. And I have here in front of me an ad that talks about the store when the brothers Chamberlain owned and operated it. And it starts out with big bold letters and it says, "Think and decide. Think carefully, decide wisely, act promptly. We possess the facilities and inclination to give you real bargains, and we will do it. Don't wait, our beautiful goods have come. In these days, good old-fashioned honesty is rare. Therefore, you will be pleased to see how we've combined old-fashioned honesty in quality and price, with fresh styles in men's, boys, and children's clothing. Styles, the latest. Qualities excellent. Prices low. You need not hesitate to accept our statements as we back them with goods and prices." Big Boston was not my only connection to the word Boston. In some circles, I was known to fancy a particular breed of dog, and that breed might be the Boston Terrier, of course. I even owned my own kennel and raised Boston Terriers there. In fact, I even showed a few of them at the Chicago Bench Show for prizes. They were a source of great satisfaction personally to me and a great feeling of accomplishment, as were some of my civic affiliations with organizations in the town of Elgin. I was a member of the Riverside Club. I was also a member of the Moose, the Elks, and the Eagles. One might say I really fancied animals. On a more serious note, it is written that on Sunday, October the 15th, in the year of 1933, I had a heavy feeling in my chest. It was difficult to breathe. My breathing was labored. 6 days later, that next Saturday, at 6:45 p.m., an attack of pneumonia stole from me my last breath, and I peacefully and quietly passed away at home. Now, the news of my illness was all over town, yet the news of my passing came as quite a shock to our innumerable friends. At the time of my passing, I was 72 years old, and coincidentally enough, my namesake, my father Joseph, had also passed away from almost the identical affliction of the lungs. Well, I can see that or feel that our time is growing short here today. And speaking of time, I used to own an Elgin pocket watch, which I understand now today is at a place called Old Main. Perhaps you've heard of it. And if you know where Old Main is, I welcome you to go there and take a look at this very unique timepiece. For you see, when you open up the cover of this old gold watch, round in its shape, and look at the face, you will see pictures of my two daughters. Near to the 9 o'clock position, you'll see a picture of Celeste. And near to the 3 o'clock position, you will see a picture of my daughter Hazel. But that's not the only unique thing about this pocket watch. For you see, all of the numbers or numerals have been removed from the face of the watch, and they have been replaced with the letters of my last name, beginning with the F in the number 1 position. So I welcome you to find out where Old Main is and take a look at that watch. You know, in 23 days, it will have been 75 years since I last talked to anyone. I want you to understand fully how much your presence here means to me today. I thank you so very much for stopping by and learning a little bit about me. And next time that you plan a trip anywhere, promise me that you'll go visit my second favorite town in all of the United States, Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you all for being here, and may your stay here today be far less in time than mine has. Thank you.
Anyway, hi, I'm Katie Thiel, and welcome to my little living room here. I'm going to tell you a little Sunday afternoon story. It's kind of a convoluted story of how I ended up in Elgin, Illinois. It wasn't planned. It was not the initial plan at all, okay? I was born February 5th, 1889 in Trier, Germany, which is part of Prussia. And if any of you know the history of the Prussians, very opinionated, outspoken, feisty, and impatient. And I fit the bill. I am Prussian. I was the 21st of my parents' 21 children. No twins or triplets. My grandma was very proud of that. My mother was very proud of that. And they were married in 1861, and I was the caboose in 89, so that tells you how long they were busy having children. Okay. Anyway, when I was 17 years old, a cousin of mine from Kewaskum, Wisconsin, was ordained a priest in Rome, and he had decided to come after his ordination to Trier, Germany, to meet the family that he'd only knew from letters or from stories from his parents. And he stayed with our family in Trier. And I was totally taken with all of his stories about life in America. Now again, being a feisty Prussian, one evening at dinner I just announced, when Father Peter Paul goes home, I'm going with him. I wanted to meet the relatives in Wisconsin that I had never met. Well, my mother looked at me and said, "How are you getting there? Walking?" Obviously not. My father, who I took very much after, again strong-willed, knew better than to argue with me, so he tried bribery instead. I always wanted a piano. It was my dream, was to have my own piano. So he said, "Katie, you stay home, and I'll buy you that piano." I was also very, very good at mathematics, and I knew the price of a piano would buy first-class passage to America. So I told my father so. That's what I wanted him to spend my money on. So the deal was struck, and that I could come to America with Father Peter Paul for a visit, but on the condition that my older sister Elizabeth would have to come with me to keep me out of trouble. Yeah, right. So plans were all made, and we had first-class passage to America. Now, we had been told, and we had heard from other travelers, that the tradition on a boat coming into harbor in New York was to be on the rail and to wave a greeting. And we wanted to be just like everyone else. But of course, we didn't speak any English, only German. And we had befriended several sailors on board because in the evenings there would always be dancing and laughter and whatnot and social hour after dinner. So we told them our wish, and they told us a little phrase that we could say to make a good impression on the American public when we arrived. So we came into port, we're on the rail. Father Peter Paul, he stepped back because he was a world traveler. This wasn't anything new to him. He wanted to make sure that we girls were on the rail. And as we pulled in, the two of us are busy waving, going, "Hello, you sons of them!" As Father Peter Paul grabbed us from behind and told us in German what we had just said. So much for first good impressions. Better to get us out of New York and back to Wisconsin quickly. And that's where we went. Now, that sister of mine who was supposed to come with to keep me out of trouble, 6 weeks after we got to Wisconsin, Father Peter Paul was planning to officiate at his first wedding as a priest for his own sister. Big, big wedding up on the farm. My sister met a young man at that wedding, was totally smitten, ran off and got married. So here I was, 17, in a strange country, with relatives I really didn't know. And being Prussian, I was too proud to admit to my father that there had been a mistake made and I was going to need passage back home. I needed to get a job. I needed to work and make my own way. I was going to make my own money and then make my own decision whether I was going to use that money to pay my own fare back home or stay here. And the relatives there found me a position as a housekeeper with a sister-in-law of the elderly relative. She needed help as a housekeeper, so that's where I went to work. She was wonderful to me. She was so good to me. She treated me like family. We got along wonderfully. And I was making good money, and I was almost to that point where I could make a decision one way or the other. Well, that sister of mine and her husband, ended up living in a little place called Elgin, Illinois that I knew nothing about. And she called me one day, about a year after they married. "Katie, could you please come? I have to have surgery, and I need help with the recovery. I just need help." She was alone, too. I told my employer, I'm not going. I didn't want to find myself in another strange town with strangers. I'm not going. Well, she convinced me. She is your sister. You go. But I didn't want to lose my job. I liked working for this lady. She says, you go, you leave your belongings here, just take what you have to have. Your job's open for you. Whenever you're ready to come back, you come back. I'll just get temporary help in the meantime. So I got on the Northwestern train from Milwaukee and I came to this place called Elgin, Illinois. Now, no one told me where the train depot was. Again, being Prussian and being impatient, as the train slowed down at Douglas Avenue, I jumped off in the dark. Nobody there. My brother-in-law was supposed to meet me there. He wasn't there. Again, no one told me there was a depot, let alone where it was. So I asked a police officer, how do I get to 511 River Street? Of course, by now I had learned to speak pretty good English. Told me, and I walked in the dark in a strange city. Got there. The good news was when I knocked on the door, my sister answered the door, so at least I wasn't lost. First thing she says to me, where's Charlie? I says, I don't know, he wasn't there. She says, well, let's go across the street. My neighbor lady has a telephone, and we'll call the depot, at least to let Charlie know that you're here. You know, don't stop waiting, come home. As we walked into her parlor, there's this very handsome young man sitting there. And I'm introduced. It's her nephew, August Thiel. We call down to my sister called the train station. Charlie wasn't there. Well, it's a damn good thing I didn't even get off at the train station. Charlie wasn't there either. Ends up, he was on the west side of Elgin. He went to the wrong train depot. And I told my sister point blank, Charlie can find his own damn way home. So, my sister recovered from her surgery. Everything went pretty well, but it was a long, long recovery, approximately 6 months. Meantime, I was very concerned about losing my position in Kewaskum. The lady was still just working with temporary help. She wanted me back the worst way when I was ready. My sister begged me not to leave her. She didn't want to be left in Elgin alone. I mean, we were really each other's only family, and she was really a stranger here. What do? I stayed in Elgin. But again, I found myself needing employment then. And I went to work as a housekeeper for Philip and Catherine Freiler. They lived at 653 Douglas Avenue. They were wonderful to me, just wonderful people. Of course, it all played into Gus's hand too, because that was only approximately 3 blocks away from where he was living with his aunt, because he had made up his mind he was going to court me. Of course, I made up my mind when I first saw him I was going to marry him, but he didn't know that. Now, it was quite a culture shock, because here I was, German Catholic, and I was going to work for German Jewish, and I had to learn how to keep kosher kitchen at 19. I learned quick. I was a fast learner. But Mr. Freiler also liked squab. You know what squab is? Pigeon. He liked to eat pigeon. And he had a huge pigeon coop on his carriage house. So that was also part of my job. One dinner alone, he had 50 guests for squab. And it was a lot of neck wringing that day. Anyway. And Gus and I were still courting. And Gus's tactics was he was a very good gentleman, always a gentleman. But he'd always say to me, "So when are we getting married?" 2.5 years we were going together. When are we getting married? And I thought, now that's one hell of a way to ask a lady for her hand. When are we getting married? We're going to do it on my time. So, Christmas, 1911, I got my engagement ring. And again, when are we getting married? I'll let you know. He got very impatient. And he says, "That's it. I'm getting a license. We're getting married." "You can't get a license without me." "Oh, yes, I can." I didn't think so. Next evening, I'm doing the dinner dishes at the Freiler's home. Telephone rings, and Mrs. Freiler says, "Katie, it's Gus. It's for you." I answer, "I got it." "You got what?" "What I told you I was going to get." I called him a damn liar, and I hung up on him. 5 minutes later, there's a knock on the door at the Freiler's home. Now, Gus used to come over every evening anyway and help me finish drying the dinner dishes. And we'd go for a walk or go over and play cards with the relatives or something. That wasn't unusual. He walks in the door and he's waving a paper under my nose. "What is that?" "What I told you I got." "Look at it, it's legal." And I looked at it, and it was a marriage license, and it had both of our names on it. Through this whole time, he never told me he was a good friend of the Kane County coroner. That would have been fun, wouldn't it? Clerk. He told him I would marry him if we could be married at St. Joseph's Church the following Sunday. The following Sunday was his birthday. I said, "Only if we can be married in church. I'm not being married in the rectory or in the parish house. It has to be in church." And Gus says, "Fine, we have to go talk to Father Rody." And I thought, yes, we'll go talk to Father Rody. He had my coat in his hand. We're going right now. And we walked down to the rectory to talk to Father Rody. Now, in those days, you had to, if you were going to be married, you had to post your banns of marriage. Basically, notice 3 weeks in advance to let other people know your intentions, just in case someone had a claim on you, if you were already married or something. So again, I figured Gus hadn't thought about that. And again, I could be setting the date. So we got down to Father Rody, and he says, "Next Sunday, what's the rush?" And he just kind of looked at me. I said, "Oh, no, Father, it's not that we have to be married." "Oh, okay, that's good." And again, everything was playing in Gus's hands. Father Rody called the bishop up and got dispensation. We were married the following Sunday after the 8:30 Mass in church. Now, I hadn't told the Freilers I was getting married. So we got married Sunday morning, and I had to get back to work and serve Sunday dinner. Gus had to wait. Of course, during the dinner, it came out that I had been married that morning to Gus, and they knew Gus, and they were very happy for me. And Mrs. Freiler says, "What are we going to do without you?" And I told her I would stay until she found a replacement. Not a problem. She says, "Well, that's fine, but you're going to have things to set up housekeeping." So the very next morning, she takes me shopping, and she buys me this chair, a matching rocker, dresser, Battenberg lace scarf to go with it, and a 100-piece set of china. She was so very generous. They both were very wonderful to me, and I stayed until they found a replacement. So Gus and I set up housekeeping on a little house over on Gertrude Street on the west side of town, and almost 9 months to the day of our marriage, our son Milton was born. Happy times, simple times. My sister-in-law had taken ill. Now, she lived on J Street, down here on the southeast side, and my husband asked me if I would go and visit with her and check on her. So I took the streetcar down to visit with her, and I had to get off on St. Charles Street. And as I walked down the hill, now at that time there was only one house on this block, big stone house in the middle of the block, and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived in the upper apartment. And as I got closer, I could see there was excavation. There was something new going to be built on the very corner. And the gentleman who was building this little home, it looks like it was just a foundation going in at the time. I stopped and he said, "Oh, you're building a house." He said, "I'm building a little house for my wife here." And he told me his name and this and that. Oh, nice. I went and visited, went home. Next day, I went again to visit my sister-in-law. Now this time, the gentleman who's building this little house, Mr. Ulrich, he called me by name. He says, "Katie, would you like to buy a house?" I said, "Well, you're building this for your wife. She tells me last night she wants a bigger house. I can sell this one." "Well, I have money for a house." I don't think so. "Thank you anyway." I went and visited, went home. Third day, again, I go to visit my sister-in-law, and Mr. Ulrich, "Katie, $50 down, and whatever you're paying a month in rent right now, you can pay me for this house, and you could have a little home of your own." Well, that got me thinking. So I went home to Gus that night, and my brother-in-law, his brother, Harry, was living with us, was sitting at the table when I came in, and I told him what Mr. Ulrich had propositioned, the deal. First thing my husband says, no way are we going to have a mortgage. We are not going into debt. And besides, we don't have $50 down to put on a house. And I said, I do. Where did you get $50? I saved it. I had opened a Christmas club. I had $49.80 in my club. My brother-in-law, Harry, heard that. He says, "Katie, you want that little house? I'll loan you the $50 and you can pay me back when your Christmas club comes up." We moved in on September 4th of 1915. And in 1916, our daughter Lucy was born in that house. I love that little house on J Street. Wonderful little house. We had happy, happy times there. So, things were good. Now, my husband worked as a plater at the Western Casket Company. Now, if you know what plating is, working with sulfuric acid. Very hot, very dangerous conditions. Of course, back in those days, there were no blowers. There was no ventilation requirements. Nobody really thought of that. You just made do. And he'd been there for quite a few years. He came home one day early from work. And Gus never came home early. He always put in his normal time plus extra if he could get it. And he came home early, and he didn't look well. He came in the house, and he just looked at me, and he sat at the dining room table. He looked at me again. He looked at our two children. He smiled at me, and he died. That was March 28th, 1931. Now, 1931 was not a good year in this country. Things were very, very tight, very hard. The silver lining I got was that the month prior, Gus had made our last mortgage payment on our house. So there I was, a widow, with a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old child. Very tough conditions, and I wasn't working, of course, at that time. My son immediately quit school to go to work at Western Casket. He went to work, and they gave him his father's job and his father's uniforms. The autopsy report from my husband came back, and it showed that he had died of what was called metallic poisoning. His liver was gone from all the fumes. I was so angry, and my son was heartsick being put in that job. I marched the next morning into the president's office of Western Casket, and I said, "You killed my husband. I will be damned if you're going to kill my son. You will give him another job." The next morning, he started as an upholsterer at Western Casket. So that worked out well. And my daughter Lucy and I, we did piecework. We did sewing for Collingbourne Mills at home at night to make extra money. So time goes by. My son Milton, he met a young lady and got married, had a family of his own. And in 1937, my daughter Lucy married a very nice young man named Joe. And what they didn't tell me was that when they were going to get married, they were going to move in with me. I was given no notice, and I did not know this. They were both at work. They both worked at the Elgin Case Company, and their bedroom furniture was delivered to my home. To this day, if you ask Lucy, I live with them. They live with me. It is my house, after all. And it was really a good thing that that happened that way, because 6 months after they were married, she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. And no insurance, of course. Young married couple. Medical bills galore. So I mortgaged my little house to pay for Lucy's care. And I went back to work. I went to Frizzy's Meat Market and worked there. from 1937 until 1958, until, once again, medical things intervened and bleeding ulcers made it mandatory that I had to quit working. Of course, Lucy had recovered from the Hodgkin's and was going. She couldn't work, but she was home. And I had 3 granddaughters now in the house to dote on and help take care of, so maybe it would be a good time to stay home. That didn't last too terribly long, though. I got an emergency call from the pastor at St. Joseph's Church. My life seems to revolve around St. Joseph's Church. Their housekeeper had taken ill and had to leave quickly. Could I possibly come, after all, I was very experienced as a housekeeper, could I come and fill in for maybe a week till they found someone? That week lasted a long time. I don't think they were ever looking for another housekeeper because the Monsignor and the other priests that were there really, really did like my cooking and baking. And the Monsignor himself had a heart attack and I helped nurse him back to health. They were like my sons. They really were. And then, like I say, they weren't looking for another housekeeper, but then that became mandatory. They had to, because one day I found myself on the floor of the rectory with a major heart attack. Within 6 weeks' time, I had gone into cardiac arrest 41 times. Yeah. I wasn't expected to live. But this was 1964, 63, 64, and there was a new little contraption created called the pacemaker. Maybe you've heard of them? Okay. I was refused one because I was too old and in too bad a shape. It would be a waste, I was told. Well, actually, I wasn't told that until later, but my family was told it would be a waste. So, the Monsignor, God love him, and my doctors in Elgin here, pled my case to the doctors at Presbyterian St. Luke's in Chicago, who were the only ones doing it at that time. And they agreed if I would basically be an experiment for them, they would implant a pacemaker. The doctors, God bless them, didn't charge me a penny, but the hospital, of course, did. And that was 18 months before Medicare had been created. You don't want to know what my bills were. But to the day I died, Dr. Weinberg and Dr. Rosenberg never charged me for another visit. I'm chugging along right now on my 9th pacemaker. That waste of a contraption bought me 20 more years of life and many more grandchildren and great-grandchildren to share my little house on J Street with. And just like it was in the 20s and 30s, I never know how many I'm setting the dining room table for Sunday dinner. 4, 12, or 20. I never know how many are going to show up. So on that, my friends, I'm going to have to excuse myself and get the table set and get the roast out of the oven before it's burnt to a crisp. Thank you for stopping in to visit with me.
Good afternoon, everyone. You've probably heard of me as Judge David B. Sherwood. Well, I'm Dave Sherwood. That's what they called me around town. I was born on March 14th, 1849. I was born in Algonquin. My father was a farmer. My farmer father came here from Kentucky. I had 5 half-brothers and sisters that my father had by his first wife. And his first wife died. He remarried. He married my mom. I was the only child that my father had with my mom. I don't remember my mother. She died when I was exactly 4 months old. I grew up in Algonquin. As a boy, I explored the dark forests of Algonquin. I climbed the high Algonquin Ridge. On many a Sunday afternoon in the summer, I swam the swift waters of the Fox River. I attended public school, that is to say district school in Algonquin. And after I finished that school, my father, being a successful farmer, was able to send me here to Elgin, to the Elgin Academy, where I completed my education. My oldest brother, Granville, read law in Texas and was practicing law in Texas. And so after I finished school, I decided to follow in Granville's footsteps. And I moved to Texas and I read law in Granville's law office. And eventually I became a member of the bar in Texas. Now, Granville's law partner, a fellow named Flournoy, was a very important lawyer in Texas. Flournoy had been one of the first attorneys general of the state of Texas. And I was practicing law with Flournoy and Granville when the Civil War started. Now, Flournoy was a hardcore rebel, and of course he joined the Confederate Army, and so did my brother Granville. Granville served in the Confederate Army all the way through the Civil War, and in fact at the end of the war, my brother Granville was a major in the Confederate Army. Now, I want to tell you about my brother Nelson. Nelson stayed here in Algonquin, and when Fort Sumter was fired on, Nelson joined the 36th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, very famous regiment. You've all heard of it, the Kane County Regiment, known as the Fox Valley Regiment. And he was in Company H, called the Woodstock Rifles, in that regiment. So my brother Nelson fought in the Civil War, and at the Great Battle of Stones River, he received a very, very serious wound. And in fact, he died from that wound many years later from complications. So I had brothers on both sides of the Civil War, but I didn't fight. I stayed back and took care of the law office in Galveston, Texas. After the war was over, after Lee surrendered to Grant and all the Confederate armies surrendered, Granville came back to the law office, but Flournoy wasn't satisfied. He got together in this crazy scheme to raise an army of Confederate veterans and invade the nation of Mexico and capture part of Mexico and create their own little confederacy in a part of Mexico where they could have their slaves and everything. Well, nothing came of that, but Flournoy left the law firm. In 1872, Granville and I met two sisters, and we were both quite smitten. In fact, we both got married. I married Philora Townsend, and she was a graduate of Oberlin College and major in literature. Laura is buried here with me. My brother Granville died a couple years after he was married. We named our oldest child, our son, Granville, and we had a daughter, Martha. In 1876, the doctor down there in Galveston told us that Martha's health was very delicate and we needed to move to a cooler climate. So we moved here to Elgin. And I set up a law office in the YMCA building downtown, and I practiced law there. To tell you the truth, I wasn't a trial lawyer or a litigator. I never liked to fight or argue very much. I was an office lawyer. I did probate, I drew wills, I did land contracts and transactions, I did business work. I bought a lot of real estate here in Elgin, including our home at 150 South State Street. In fact, years later, when Martha got married, my wedding present to her and her husband was the house next door at 149 South State Street. Bought it for her. I had a successful practice, and in 1890, I ran for election as a county judge, and I won. Now, that may not seem remarkable to you, but here's what you don't know. By inheritance and lifelong habit, I was a Democrat. So in 1890, I ran for judge in Kane County as a Democrat. And Kane County was strictly a very hardcore Republican county in those days. I'm sure that's changed. I was elected county judge, and I want to remind you a little bit about those times. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, had been elected president. He ran for re-election against Benjamin Harrison. Cleveland won the popular vote. In other words, more people voted for Cleveland than for Benjamin Harrison, but Benjamin Harrison won in the Electoral College. So Harrison became president and Cleveland was out of office. 4 years later, when Harrison ran for re-election, they had a rematch. Cleveland ran again, and this time he won. So Cleveland became president for the second time, but I'll bet after a couple years, he wished he hadn't. Because within just a couple years, the great financial panic of 1893 occurred. You all remember it. All the big brokerage firms and investment banks on Wall Street went out of business. Banks all over the United States failed, and the depositors lost all their money. Millions of people lost their jobs. Houses were foreclosed on, so many that real estate values went down nationally by 25%, and in some areas by 50%. However, I was okay. There may have been a financial panic, but I didn't panic. I held on to my real estate. There is no better investment than Elgin real estate. Anyway, it was in that atmosphere that I had to run for re-election in 1894, and everybody blamed Grover Cleveland and the Democrats for the financial panic, and I lost. I was out of office. I wasn't a judge anymore. You know, sometimes in your life, something that seems terrible to you at the time happens, and it turns out to be good. And this was such a case. After I lost my bid for re-election as a county judge, I really got involved in business. I was one of the first investors and shareholders and directors of the Elgin City Railway Company, Elgin's first electric railroad. I was one of the founders and investors in the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Railway. I'm sure many of you took one of their trains here today. I was one of the first investors and shareholders and directors of the Elgin Wind Power and Pump Company, a very, very successful firm. I was a director at the Elgin National Bank in these years. I was one of the founders of the Elgin Shoe and Shirt Factory. And I'm sure many of you are wearing Elgin shoes. I know I am. In 1897, my beloved wife, Laura, died. I'm happy to say that both of my children lived into successful adulthood. I continued to practice law. I remarried in 1900. In 1906, I ran for probate judge, a county-wide office. And I was elected, even though I ran as a Democrat. And I'm very proud of a newspaper article that said that among my most ardent supporters were many lifelong Republicans. Folks, when I tell the story this way, it probably sounds like I was a wealthy man, but I have to tell you, in confession, I really wasn't. I should have been, but I wasn't because of my two great weaknesses. And Laura and I had many a debate related to these two weaknesses. The first of my weaknesses was horses. When I came here from Texas, I brought 20 horses with me. I owned a farm outside of town where I kept my horses. I don't think I ever saw a horse for sale that I didn't buy. My second great weakness was books. There was almost never a time where the postman came to our house where he didn't have a package of books that I had ordered from some publishing house. I loved books, and when Laura was alive, she loved books too. In fact, it got to the point where I, by myself, had one of the largest libraries in Kane County, counting and including all of the public libraries in Kane County. Well, I was elected probate judge, and I enjoyed being a probate judge and serving the people very much. On my last day, I went to my law office as usual at the normal time. It was a Saturday morning, And at 8:30, I went to the barber shop. Our newest circuit judge, Judge Carney, was having a banquet held in his honor in Sycamore that night. 250 lawyers were expected to be in attendance, and I was the keynote speaker, so I wanted to look nice. I got up from the barber's chair and felt very ill. I was stricken. I collapsed. My doctor of many years was called, and he came to the barber shop and examined me, was very concerned, and he called for an ambulance. And the ambulance and the doctor took me to my home. The doc was so upset, I tried to make a joke with him in the ambulance to the effect that he should try some old-fashioned remedy like a body plaster to cure my illness. But when I arrived home, I died very quickly. On January 7th, 1908, I was buried here next to the grave of my wife. My pallbearers included leading judges and lawyers from my era. And the probate court was closed that day so that everybody could come to my funeral. Well, it was nice of all of you to come, but I confess I was just at the part of this book where the Confederate general at Fort Donelson is asking General Grant for terms of surrender. So if you don't mind, I'm going back to my books. Have a great afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alice Bird Potter. I was born in 1875. My parents, Charles Potter and Elvira Mann, came from quite prominent families during the early days of Elgin. And my father assumed our family farm at age 14 when my grandfather passed. As a very young man, he was capable, he had excellent business abilities and was able to maintain the family farm, giving us a comfortable lifestyle. He also became entrepreneurial and helping build businesses here during the early days of Elgin. One of his first companies that he co-founded was the Elgin Butter Company, and this caused him to have to travel across the United States where he was marketing this famous business. He came back to become the president of the Elgin Board of Trade and was one of those responsible people that helped determine the price of butter across the world. He also helped put together the Elgin Creamery, and as the vice president and general manager, it was a wonderful business that they started. As a little tot, I was known as Birdie. That's my middle name, and that name stuck throughout my life. I was often seen dancing, singing. Music was a way of life for me, and throughout my life I became a teacher. I taught not only dance, voice lessons, but also I taught piano, guitar, mandolin, and banjo. I fell in love with a musician, and I was married in my parents' home to John Tetzner when I was 20. Our marriage lasted only 9 years because even though we had a mutual love for music, that could not hold our marriage together. And we were separated then for about 4 years until our divorce became final, and I was then granted the permission to go back to my family name, Potter. Something unique about me was that I was always intrigued with the automotive industry, which was just beginning to grow. And there was a gentleman by the name of Elwood Haynes from Kokomo, Indiana, that founded the Haynes Automobile Company. Well, the first year there were 350 cars produced, and I became the proud owner of one of them. So it was quite often you could see Birdie driving in her proud automobile through the roads of Elgin. Elwood noticed that it was unusual for a woman to be so intrigued by the automobile industry and asked me if I would be interested in a competition. He was thinking this would help grow his new business. Well, of course I said yes. Now it was a 3-mile run out of Harlem. And when my friends here in town heard about it, they all wanted to join and be supportive. And so along my Haynes, we had a couple of Fords, Buicks, Packard, there was a Maxwell, and a Rambler, and we all went to Harlem, and I won the race. Well, I won the race by default. You see, when we arrived there, the other two women that I was to compete with took one look at the track and declined to race. But it was a great experience for me, and it set me up for the biggest tour of my life, which was to take place next year. I was allowed to be the first woman to drive from Chicago to New York without a man. So, on July 16th, in front of the Chicago Auditorium, me and my three best friends pulled out with my special Haynes car. In the front seat was my friend Ida, she was from Elgin, and in the back seat were my two friends, both Elizabeth. One was from St. Charles and the other one was from Geneva, and we took off. And we were waving at all the cheering fans, and you know, it didn't even matter that none of my friends knew how to drive, and they didn't know anything about tinkering with cars either. They were there to be supportive and to cheer me on, and they were just as adventurous as me. And I told them from the get-go, this is not going to be a race. We're going to enjoy this journey, and we're going to get there safely. So when anything tickled their fancy and they wanted me to pull over, we stopped. We met many different people who came alongside the road to cheer us on from different automobile clubs. They brought us fresh water, and sometimes they invited us to stay at their home. Now, I knew this was going to be quite a stunt for a woman to drive so far unassisted by a man, but I never had any idea how much national recognition I was going to gain. Why, I have a couple excerpts from our local papers. This one is from the Daily News announcing, although the feat is a remarkable one, the driver, Alice Potter, is well known for her ability in handling a machine, and it's not anticipated she'll meet with difficulty. She's depending entirely on her knowledge of the mechanism of the automobile to repair such breakdowns as occur and to care for the car until it reaches its eastern destination. And we did have several challenges along the way. 4 women driving with lots of dust and mud and gravelly ditches that we had to get through. There was rain along the way as well. The newspaper reporters enjoyed commenting on that, and in fact the Toledo Times described me and my friends as covered with dust and hungry as bears. We did have a few roadblocks along the way, and one of those was on a bridge that was broken down on our way into Toledo. We drove alongside the river until we got to a shallow part and drove right through. And when we finally arrived in Buffalo, New York, they sent a reporter out to interview us. And he was quoted as saying in the paper, 4 girls with sunburned noses and clothes covered with mud arrived at the Iroquois at 8 o'clock last night after motoring from Ashtabula yesterday. The party, scorning the assistance of any man, is making the run from Chicago to New York. Miss Alice Potter, driver of the car, master mechanic, tire repairer, oiler, quite a fine reporter, wasn't he? And general expert. He said I was a slight girl, but I'm definitely game. And he asked me if we had any trouble along the way. I didn't tell him about the bridge. But I was very proud to tell him that my Diamond tires still had Chicago air on them, inside of them, when we arrived at New York. He asked me if we brought any weapons, and I told him only these. We had a wonderful run coming back. We drove in tandem with a Mercedes, and I was proud that my Haynes automobile survived some of the ditches that the Mercedes did not. So we arrived back to Chicago on August 22nd. And it was a wonderful run. You'll see on my stone that it says first woman driver for Chicago to New York. I'm very proud of that. Now, although I never remarried or had any children, I want you to know that my life was complete, was very rich. I spent many days at the Elgin Country Club. I continued to teach. I was active with the Keynote Club here in town. I was also a member of DAR, which is Daughters of the Revolution, the Revolutionary War, and I also was active with the Humane Society. I helped put that together. I loved animals like these two here. I wanted to make sure that that animals were not used for medical advancements, and so that was very important to me. And I lived to be 80 years old. I died at St. Joseph Hospital, and it was a wonderful life. And you've been quite an attentive audience despite all of the bugs today. How many people here are drivers? How many drivers? Oh wow, we have a lot of drivers. Well, that's okay. Let me just quickly, listen, you didn't see these photographs, did you? I'll just show you these photographs real quick. And then, can we just pass that around? So you can see me and you never knew what you were going to get with me. Sometimes I was a garage mechanic and sometimes I was a socialite. But okay, we'll just bring that through. Thank you. So for the drivers, I would like to offer you, because I am only here one day, if I could assist you with any tune-ups that you may need, I would be glad to do so for you. Thank you for coming today.
Oh my goodness, hello. Excuse me, I was just straightening up the merchandise. It's been a rather busy day today. Had a little bit of a lull, so I thought I could clean up a little. How may I help you? What would you like to purchase? Well, perhaps you'd like to think about that for a little bit, and while you do, I would like to tell you my story of how I came into the grocery store business, with your permission. My name is Libby Samuelson. I was born on August 14th, 1859 in Fulton, Illinois, a town near the Mississippi River. Now, when I was about 12 years old, my family moved to Chicago. I was actually a witness to that great Chicago fire in 1871, and I know you've all heard of it. That fire started Sunday, October 8th, and burned through the morning of October 10th. It was a terrible fire. It destroyed many neighborhoods. 300 people were killed, and over 90,000 people were left homeless. My family lived in the 17th Ward, and our neighborhood was one of those neighborhoods that was destroyed. Fortunately, my family did survive. Now, little did I know then that one of the neighboring towns that would provide relief for the fire victims would become my hometown, and that was Elgin, Illinois. When news of the fire spread over the wires, Elgin citizens formed a committee and sought help from local bakeries and individual families. They asked the bakeries and families to bake bread that could be sent into the city. On the morning of October 10th, the morning that the fire actually burned itself out, at 4:30 in the morning, a train arrived, the Chicago and Northwestern, entered Chicago, and in one of the cars were more than 2,000 loaves of bread, other food, and clothing for fire victims. The following day, once again, Elgin citizens sent food, clothing, blankets for the victims. Some people even went into the city from Elgin and helped to deliver the supplies. This went on for over a week. The fine character of Elgin citizens has always remained in my heart, at how generous and kind they were to us and to other Chicago people. Well, my family then did move to Elgin, and it was there that I met my husband, F. Albert, but I called him Frank. He worked at the watch factory. We had 3 wonderful children, Edna, Edith, and Florence. Now, Edna died as a young baby. She was just a year old when she died. We built a home at 464 Ashland Avenue in 1887. Very comfortable home. We were happy there. Unfortunately, Frank died in that home from an internal abscess at the very young age of 29. So there I was with 2 girls, 4 years old and 4 months old, and a large mortgage. Mr. C.E. Botsford of Elgin purchased the mortgage on our house for $500. The value of Frank's items at death was a little more than $100. So I was in dire straits. What was I to do? I had these 2 young girls, 4 years old, 4 months old, to provide for, and no job. Well, fortunately, my mother had built a home in 1888 right next door to us. Ulrika Anderson was her name. And the girls and I were able to move in with Mother. We did recover the mortgage on the house. So I was able to take the house back. And my sisters and I then opened a grocery store on the first floor of our home. We converted the second floor into an apartment and rented that out for additional income. Now, grocery stores were a little different than they were later in my life. My sisters and I opened that store and operated it from 1894 to 1918. Neighborhood stores were not uncommon then, run by families. We sold mostly staples, items that would be needed to prepare meals. And in those days, women did actually prepare meals from scratch. So they needed flour and lard and sugar and spices. We did not sell milk because milk was delivered to your home. If you needed meat, you went to the butcher shop. If you needed bakery items, bread or pastries, you went to a bakery or baked your own. So those were items that we did not carry. But we did carry cigars to keep the husbands happy and some candy, chocolates and hard candy. You probably have noticed quite a few Elgin items here. Elgin did produce many food items. We have the Lady Elgin pastry flour from the Elgin Flour and Feed Company. We have the Kerber Packing Company, which produced lard, which was needed for baking. And the Elgin Packing Company canned vegetables. Now, these were not a really popular item because many families have their own gardens and they grew their own vegetables. But those that couldn't could purchase canned vegetables. We also had a Borden milk condensing plant on Brook Street. That is such a popular item that I don't have a can to show you. I'm totally sold out, but that was something that was quite popular. 1908 was an important year for me. That year my mother died and she left her home to me and my sister. I had one sister remaining at that time. My girls grew into beautiful young women and pursued their career of teaching. Both of them were teachers. I saw many changes during my lifetime. Remember, I was born in 1859 and I died in 1951. I lived until I was 91 years old. During that time, I saw airplanes were invented. I saw automobiles that replaced horse and buggy. Televisions appeared in living rooms with faces and voices. Very unusual, so many changes, hard for me to understand. One of the biggest changes to me was the change in the grocery store. There were still some neighborhood stores, but now, in the later years of my life, people could go to one supermarket and purchase milk and eggs and bakery goods and meat and prescription drugs. Just anything you wanted was in this supermarket. That was really difficult for me to comprehend. As I say, I lived till I was 91 and died in 1951 on February 8th. I am forever grateful to my family, to my mother and to my two sisters, because if it weren't for them, I never would have been able to provide for my daughters. I don't know what I would have done. I'm also very grateful that I had good health and that I was able to own and operate my very own business. Something I'm rather proud of. If you looked in this directory, this telephone directory, 1901, you would find the name L.A. Samuelson, grocer, in it. That's my story. Now, who would like to purchase something? I'm ready to sell. If you would like to come back, perhaps you can come back later when you've decided what to buy. Thank you so much.
I'll start out by asking how many of you are superstitious. Not everyone admits to that, yet we are affected by superstition without even knowing it. Webster defines superstition, if I can find it, as any belief or attitude based on fear or ignorance that is inconsistent with the known laws of science or with what is generally considered in the particular society as true and rational. Do you cover your mouth when you yawn? Most people do, but do you know why? Superstition tells us that we must cover our mouth when we yawn to prevent evil from entering our body and to keep our spirit from leaving us. Are you careful not to step on the cracks on the sidewalk? Don't step on the crack, you'll break your mother's back. Do you watch out for black cats? Don't let a black cat cross in front of you. And how many times have you? We're told that we should throw spilled salt over our left shoulder, or is it the right? Right shoulder, left shoulder. Aha, she knew. So, are you superstitious, or is that just a flashback to your childhood? I'll bet a lot of you still do not open an umbrella in the house. Superstition is related to almost everything we do, but when it comes to death, the number of superstitions is endless. There are certain things a person must do to ward off bad luck or evil spirits. Superstition says if you see an ambulance or a hearse, you must touch a button, or you will be the next one in it. Clocks in the home of the deceased should be stopped. You must hold your breath when you pass a cemetery, so evil spirits will not enter your body. In making coffins, the carpenter must collect the sawdust and shavings and put them in the coffin, because if any of that enters the house, death will follow. A dead person's eyes must be closed, or he will find someone to take with him. There are also things we must not do. Do not smell the flowers that grow on a grave, or you'll lose your sense of smell. Do not count the conveyances in a funeral procession. Do not erect a tombstone before a year's time after a death, or another member of the family will die. Never put your shoes on the table, or you will die by hanging. These are not my shoes. A woman should not be buried in black, or she will come back and haunt the family. Birds and animals play an important role in superstition. A rooster crowing at midnight means death is nearby. Counting 6 crows will cause death. Seeing a white chicken on the way to a funeral is a bad omen. If a cow moos at midnight, it is an evil omen. Hearing a hen crow means bad luck, unless you kill the hen. If a cow raises its head and smells the air, death is nearby. There are many warning signs of death that you can watch for. If cracks appear in bread while baking, if you miss a row of planting, if you hear a dog howling under the window, if a picture falls from the wall, if a horse neighs at a funeral. Then there are the superstitions that defy all logic. After eating boiled eggs, you must crush the shells to prevent witches from sailing out to sea in them and drowning sailors. If you say Mary Worth 100 times in a mirror in a darkened room and she appears in the mirror, you will die soon. And what of this? 7 years bad luck. A dog howling at night when someone is sick is a bad omen, but it can be reversed by simply reaching under the bed and turning over a shoe. If you brush your hair more than 111 times, someone in the house will die. When a loved one dies, you should sprinkle bourbon around the room in small drops to ward off evil spirits. Seems like a waste of good bourbon to me. Most people believe in heaven, but how do you get there? Superstition tells us a person who dies on Good Friday will go straight to heaven. A person who dies at midnight on Christmas Eve will immediately enter the gates of heaven because they are open at that time. Thunder following a funeral means the deceased has entered heaven. The soul of a dying person cannot escape and go to heaven if the doors of the house are locked. If rain falls on a corpse, that person has gone to heaven. So, apparently it doesn't matter how good you are, it's all a matter of timing. Many religious traditions originated in ancient times and are considered superstition by many. Burning incense, lighting candles, covering the casket with a pall or a black cloth, praying over the deceased, or laying a crown on the head of the deceased to assure that they will have a crown when they enter heaven. As you wander through the cemetery today, look to see what grows on the grave sites. Superstition says, if the person buried there was a good person, flowers will grow on their grave. But if they were evil, only weeds will grow. So enjoy your tour of the cemetery, and thank you for listening.